Welcome to the Legion Strength and Conditioning Podcast. You can check us out at legionsc.com or follow us on Instagram at legion.sc. All right, so we're doing a topical CrossFit Games wrap-up, and Luke was there coaching some national champs. So he has some in-depth behind-the-scenes reporting, right? Luke, how was your experience coaching this year?
It was really good. I was privileged enough to help out two athletes in preparation and then also at the event. I had Haja, who I've been working with for the last 2.5 years. She was the national champion of Kuwait. She's a good CrossFit competitor. She's competed at quite a high standard in the region, but not necessarily at a sanctions level yet. But she's sort of fully aware of that, and she really enjoyed the experience. She came away with it pretty pumped and ready for the Open. And then as well as that, we had Trang, she qualified through Vietnam. She was basically just training with one of my friends, and she qualified, I think, mainly because of her ability to do strict handstand push-ups. And then she started working with me a couple of months before the competition. At the competition, it was pretty good. It was interesting to sort of see the difference in abilities and the different things going on. Like, for instance, on the Wednesday, you had obviously a lot of games athletes, or like a lot of the elite training, or looking like they were just training, not necessarily going through super light work for everyone else, but for them it was. So, a couple of questions were like, why are they training the day before competition? I was like, well, they're probably just doing some like recovery type stuff. Anyway, and then you had a lot of people who were there just sort of more, say, starstruck. So some of the national champions just sort of walking around with sort of selfie sticks constantly, and I can imagine it being a bit could be slightly annoying for some of the elite, and that's the reason why they said no social media in the sort of training area that was going on, which was understandable. But yeah, we sort of, there was rumours of the workout the night before. I think a couple of people sort of had a look at .com and then pulled it up, and then they went out there, they performed their best. They got cut on the first workout, unfortunately, but for them it wasn't necessarily a workout where they would have been able to sort of express their true capacity. They were very much limited by sort of strength. So, they hit the run, and Trang didn't get any legless rope climbs, and then had just struggled on the snatches. But sort of funny story, once the sort of cuts happened, and I think this was sort of the theme going on throughout the games, they sort of brought everyone to the bleachers. So all of the individuals would go to the bleachers, and then they would call out the 75 that made it, and then they would have 75 people, or roughly about 75 people still left sitting down, and then they would say, okay, now all of your coaches need to come up and sit with you. So we had to go into the bleachers, and then they basically sort of just said, you guys, sort of your weekend is over. The athletes, you can hold on to your pass. You can train here if you want to for the remainder of the games. But coaches, you guys aren't allowed in this area, and we're going to give you a ticket. So they sort of took us out like this back door and made us like cross our names off, and then snipped my coach's pass, which was like, I can't creep on all these games athletes for the rest of the weekend. Shit, I can't steal the good Wi-Fi. But yeah, I mean, it was a cool experience. It was pretty funny. My first time at the game, so I don't really have anything to compare it to. But it was it was really good. And then the atmosphere in the sort of the warm up area was very much just sort of like a bit unknown. It was interesting. It was just sort of, you obviously have some people who it's just like another day at the office, and then you have some people who are just like, this is the biggest experience in their life. So it was quite polarized in that sense. Very interesting to sort of be an observer, and yeah, I enjoyed it. And I didn't really enjoy getting my coach's pass cut off, but such is life. And
you are no longer a coach.
I was officially cut. It wasn't like the sort of you're cut from the leaderboard. It was like they cut the thing with a pair of scissors. So it was yes, I mean it was, but like I mean I wish I wish I could have been a fly on the wall and sort of just creep on some people warming up and trying to sort of find out what the secret squirrel stuff is about, you know.
What do you do? What do you do to make it to the top 10? What are your secrets? Luke, how did you approach communicating with your athletes, right? Going into an event like that where you know there's going to be a huge amount of cuts afterwards, and they're probably not expected to make it past that event based upon the structure of it. What do you say to them going into something like that, given that they've traveled in both cases, completely halfway across the world to run a little bit and maybe not do much else?
I mean, for both of them, they were sort of pretty aware of their situation, and I think I told them before that, I was like, you obviously you have to be sort of proud of yourselves and what you've achieved to get here, but as well as that, sort of the work that you've done, since you were sort of crowned national champion to come into the games. You've both made long trips. But this is the new structure of the sport, and obviously there's lots of people out there that think that the old structure is much better, but this is the new structure and you officially belong here. And it's just the same at the Olympics. You have this same situation going on. If you look at Olympic weightlifting, you could field the whole A and B categories with lifters from from Russia and China and countries like that, and the people from other countries aren't going to get a look in. But that's not the case. So I had to sort of tell them that they belong and tell them to perform their best and to bring as much as they could to the workout. Like for Trang, I think she let the occasion get to her and she just climbed up the rope, like was very, very, very close to getting there, and then came down and then tried again and didn't rest up long enough. For Hadja, I was sort of stood in the stands and I was just basically just said like rest. And she was able to sort of see that, and then she just sat down, and I was like, "Yep," because that's the way they had to approach it. I think for both of them, it was that workout. If they did that workout in their gym, they would probably be able to do better than they did. But like the circumstances of the games, you got new ropes. They have to make a reach beyond 15 feet, which they're not used to doing, let alone climbing up 15 feet. Because I think Trang's, the roof of her gym is even smaller than that. But, a big thing for them was just making sure that they lapped up the experience. They put everything out there for the day that they were competing, and as well as that, making sure that their preparation for it was perfect. I said, this is an opportunity that you guys have, and I know that they doubted whether they were going to take that opportunity in the first place. But I said, if you look at this in 5 years' time, when this becomes the normality, then you're going to wish that you did that. So there's, you should do it, and and use it to fuel what you're going to go through next year. And I think both of them are looking forward to the Open. I think for Trang, she needs to sort of have a look at the leaderboard. I think there's probably a lot more interest, for instance, stateside with people who have like a Vietnamese passport. For Hadja, she pretty much knows her competition now. But I think, the main thing was just telling them that they earned the right to be there, and they need to, as cliche as it sounds, put everything out there and, be confident that position is theirs.
I was pretty impressed with Hadja in the sense that I think you had her do one rope climb like every 5 minutes or something like that, right? And that's the discipline to do something like that when you're like, okay, I'm on the big stage and like I really gotta show people what I can do, and there's going to be a huge cut after this, so I need to make sure that I'm putting myself in the best position to potentially move on, to actually say, you know what, I can do one of these every 5 minutes, so I'm just going to sit here and I'm going to actually make it through, and just about everyone else, in my heat is going to try to go too soon and just fall apart. So, what did you say to her to get her to buy into that process?
Well, I think for her, she's in competitions, and this is something we're going to have to work on at some stage, but in competitions, in the past, I've sort of been around and been able to sort of guide her through it, and she's pretty just trusting in what I say. So if I tell her do this, she does it, and there's no sort of argument around it, and she's not necessarily she's not trigger happy when she gets out there, and she can stay pretty focused on sort of what she has to do. I told her that I said that this is going to be harder than training. I said that I got to climb up the rope in the warm up area, and she said, well, this is more challenging. It's like the rope is slippier, and as well as that, I think even in the warm up area, the ropes were shorter as well, or they just didn't have to make that reach. But yeah, she saw me in the crowd. I was basically just there to try and get some videos and some pictures. But luckily, on the sort of back end of the North Park venue, there wasn't very many people sat down. So she sort of saw me with my t-shirt on, and then she sort of was looking over, and then I just basically pointed to my watch, and then I just put like 5, and then she got the gist of it, and she did a rope climb every 5 minutes, and then she had a couple of minutes to go at the snatch, which unfortunately she wasn't able to do.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think that's and I mean, we were talking about this, but she actually came like kind of uncomfortably close to making that first cut based upon that, which is pretty cool, right? Maybe not expected. If you think about the workout, like, okay, how far are people going to get in this? But it's like, oh, if you actually made it through your rope climbs, like you did reasonably well relative to the field on that. Yeah,
like I think there were people who were making it through the cuts who were basically just on that run. So, I think that she can snatch that weight, but she can't snatch that weight after she's basically just gone through some like maximal effort upper body pulling, which is understandable. So, for her, it's just, for something like that, it would be about just making sure that she can manage that situation a lot better. And at some stages, I want to be able to sort of take a step back, and for her to be able to just have the intuition to be able to handle those challenges independently, because I'm not necessarily always going to be able to be there. But yeah, I think that overall she did really well, and she put her best foot in. And I think for the women as well, like people were talking about potentially adjusting the workout just because of the amount of people who weren't getting through the rope climbs was quite a lot. So I'm not too sure of the scoring of it, but I think there was at least not quite a third of the field, but potentially like a quarter of the field couldn't make it through, and everyone around Haja and it was just basically climbing up the rope halfway and then just falling down, climbing up the rope halfway, and just no one was resting, and it was just rookie errors, rookie mistakes, and they just thought that the occasion was going to carry them through it, and I was like, no, it's not. once your biceps are gone, they're gone.
There was only 4 women that completed it.
The whole thing.
Yeah. The rest of the field got capped.
Yeah, so like, I mean, if only 4 people complete the workout, like, what was that compared to the men? Come on, John. Stats, man.
I mean, we didn't talk about this beforehand, so I didn't have the numbers prepared.
Refresh your data, John.
44 completed.
Yeah. I mean, you always expect to see that with like upper body pulling dominant things like that, like a legless rope climber or whatever. Well, and since we've been talking about these cuts, right? Obviously, a very controversial topic. Much YouTube bandwidth has been consumed based upon these cuts. I mean, Luke, what are your thoughts surrounding the structure of the competition and the cutting?
Well, I think that the way that the only way the new structure of the games, with having all of the national champions and a lot of people qualifying through various different routes, like, you have to cut the field. So I think that's okay and that's fair and it's part of sport. What I do believe that obviously it could be refined, the process can be refined, and I think that's what a lot of people are saying. I think the cut to 75 at the start was appropriate, or something like that had to happen very, very early on. Some people did travel all of that way to run 400 meters. If you look at it from that point of view, but then if you look at it from the point of view of all the work that they did beforehand, all the preparation that they went through and everything like that, it's not just that. And I know it might seem like that on the surface, but I just think that the execution of the cuts and how they went about it could have changed. I think everyone's obviously talking about like the the Saturday cut down from 10 down to 20, and then you obviously have several athletes that were penalised on that who were unhappy. But I think I heard, what's his name, Brent Fikowski, I think he was talking to Arm & Hammer, and it was like, he said he was coming away from one of the events and someone was saying, I've trained so hard and I don't deserve to be cut, or something along those lines. And he's like, well, in his head he was thinking, this is sport. And I think that is the case, and I think that it's ruffled quite a few feathers, but this whole season has. Like, if you think about all of those sort of middle tier bubble athletes that wanted to go to regionals, like, they've had essentially what was their competition, what they were competing for, taken away. So, there is always going to be some domino effect, and that's always going to have some knock-on effect. And you've seen that within the games with people who compete at the highest level, have high expectations, but didn't execute. I felt that, the event was ruthless, but there was a little bit of a cool element to it, which was, hey, to make it to the next part of the games, you have to run for your life, which was, it's like if you're thinking about it in terms of, people have spoken about the testing not necessarily being as broad at the start, but I think that is more in line with the direction that CrossFit is taking now, and what was sort of like originally put out there in sort of like early journal articles and interviews with Glassman and etc.
Yeah, I agree with that. I liked the testing this year. I thought it was pretty interesting, and I liked a lot of the events. But I do think that people have an expectation of what CrossFit is, which is not what CrossFit actually is, right? People think that CrossFit is like heavy thrusters and muscle ups, or they think that CrossFit is, like certain types of couplets. You say like, oh, I'm doing a CrossFit workout. Like, people assume that means I'm doing 21-15-9 of, deadlifts and some gymnastics movement. But that pretty clearly that's not what CrossFit is in those early CrossFit Journal articles, nor is that what should be tested in the sport either. So I think there is that disconnect between what fans want and, what the sport is defined as. But I do think that the cuts are obviously controversial, and I think that there's a few different layers to that. Which I actually wrote something about this on my blog, just about the balance of like luck and skill in sport. And I think that a lot of the things that people are saying about the cuts are like wrong and not terribly helpful. Like whoever Fikowski was talking about, saying like, oh, I don't deserve to be cut. It's like, yo, it's sport. Like, you don't get what you deserve, right? You get what happens. And I think that also there's an element of, if you have signed up to like play CrossFit, so to speak, you kind of, you assume that there are some basic expectations you can have surrounding what the sport is going to look like and what the events are going to look like, but you sort of know that you've signed up to just like do whatever Greg and Dave decide is going to happen. And that's just like consistently been a part of this sport, is like, oh, like now it's this way. Oh, now it's this way. Like, oh, we're going to fly you here at this time and like not tell you what's happening. And that, that sort of like psychological gamesmanship, and like, you don't know what to expect, and the rules are going to suddenly change on you. Like, that seems to fundamentally be part of the way that they view testing, as well as potentially how they run the organization, right? And I think that some of that may be like internal disorganization. I think some of that is actually just like, we want to mess with you psychologically and see how you react. And if you think something like, oh, I deserve to be here, and then you underperform, it's like, well, guess what? Like, you clearly don't deserve to be here based upon that.
Yeah, like I think Castro was saying, I mean, I think a lot of people got triggered by it, but he was just saying, be better. Just be better next time. And it was like, yep. Because there were some people like spitting their dummy out, and some people who were like quite high up, like spitting their dummy out and actually being a little bit.
What colloquialism is this? Spitting their what out?
Spitting their, what do you call it in America?
I don't know.
What's the
I don't know what it is.
Pacifier.
Pacifier, yeah.
Oh.
So like,
cool.
Sorry, listeners. I've I'm currently in the UK for a couple of days, so I've picked up these like things that I used to say before. But so yeah, they were spitting their pacifiers out. That doesn't fucking sound right.
You could also say throwing the toys out of the pram, but that also doesn't make sense.
Yeah,
that I would have understood that one. I would have been able to understand that with context clues. I thought it was like a drink or something. Like it's like doing like a spit take. Like it's like what beverage is this?
But, I mean, I think there is an element of you can be kind of frustrated with how it turned out, in the sense that I don't think the final 10 on either side were the 10 fittest athletes there.
But based on the testing, they were.
Based on the order of the testing, they were.
Yeah, I agree with that, John.
Yeah.
And it's not to say they didn't deserve to be in the top 10, because they did the work and they made it through the cuts. But if you were to, let's say the final cut took it down to 20 instead of 10. Yes. Firstly, you look on the guy's side, well, Will Murad's coming last because he hurt himself in the last event before the cut and basically did nothing in the remainder of the events. And then, you look at other guys like, okay, is Vellner going to make some improvements? Is he going to make it into the top 10? Probably. I don't think he's making podium from that position, but on the women's side, it's like, okay, if it was again top 20, you look at some of those events that came up and it's like, okay, maybe the 8th, 9th and 10th in the top 10 don't stay in the top 10 and other people move up.
I agree in that, and I think that you probably would have some movement outside, for instance, maybe from 5 to 10. But then I also believe that, like, if you think, and this is what the big part of the games is, they want to crown the fittest man and the fittest woman on earth, and you look at Fraser and you look at Tia and their dominant performances throughout the weekend. Despite things falling out of bags and all of that type of stuff. But it's like that in terms of, for Greg and Dave, they've pretty much done their job in terms of trying to find that. Which I think is.
I don't think the result changes. I don't. I think if it had been cut to 20 instead of 10 for the men, I think Fraser wins by more. Noah was able to stay closer to him because, he. Even if Fraser wins the event and Noah can get in second or third, he's kind of hanging on. You add in a few of those athletes that are in the 10 to 20 range, and they're like, okay, are they going to sneak in between them on workouts and push Noah down a little bit more? I think Fraser wins by more, had the cuts been less aggressive. But yeah, I don't think the overall winners would have changed. I think likelihood is the top 4 would have probably been the same. And then some variation from there down. But like we're saying, it's a sport and that's what happens and that's how it goes. You can look at other sports and say, well, if this team had played a different team in the semi-finals of the World Cup, then maybe they get to the final. It's just how it goes.
It seems as both of you guys have pointed out the order of events, you would sort of change those up and stuff. Like, how would you, based off of now seeing all of the tests and all of the events, how would you have changed that up? Say, for instance, if there was going to be another same scenario, you're going to be cutting it from 10 down to 20. What would you have changed? What workouts would you have switched up?
I actually don't think it's the order that matters. I think it's just the fact that if you make cuts that quickly, then the order matters no matter what you do.
Okay.
Right. And I think that's what people are reacting negatively to. Right. I don't think most people are articulating it, but like John said, right, there's always a blend of luck and skill in any type of sport or competition. And people like sports to be largely dictated by like the skill or ability, with just enough luck to allow for like Cinderella stories or underdogs or like surprising outcomes. But they don't want to watch a game that's like entirely dictated by luck, right? They want things that are almost entirely skill with just a little bit of luck to make it interesting and allow for variation. And I think that what people are reacting to is the fact that CrossFit already has a pretty significant amount of luck involved in outcomes based upon the structure of the events. judging errors, etc. So I think that by adding the additional layer of now the actual order of the events matter quite a bit in terms of dictating the outcome, because if you happen to get, 3 events in a row that are just like not good for you, even though you would have crushed some other stuff, then you're essentially out of the competition. And I think that just pushes that ratio a little bit too far for people, where they're like you said, John, they're sort of like, oh, well, I don't think that this is actually the fittest, quote unquote, people as we think of the outcome of the sport, right? If you think of some other sport, like say, the NBA playoffs or something like that, and if you are a fan of basketball and you're watching the entire regular season, and then the teams that actually make the playoffs are just like very obviously not the best teams, other than like the 1 or 2 at the top, you're kind of like, well, that doesn't make any sense. Like, this is kind of a dumb sport if it doesn't actually select for what we think it should be selecting for. And I don't necessarily agree with people's opinions on like what fitness is, but I do think that that's what they are reacting to, as well as just the experience of the athletes themselves, right? Because I think that the other thing that really matters is not just finding the fittest athletes, which I completely agree with what you said, John, that, Matt and Tia win pretty much no matter what you do, provided the events look basically like what we would consider to be CrossFit. You could certainly come up with some sort of combination of like fitness testing that they would not win at. But if we have, the basic landscape of tests that we've seen at the CrossFit Games, I think that those 2 win pretty much no matter how you structure it. But for everyone else, they're there not just to like get beaten, right? They're there to provide an ecosystem for the entire sport to exist. So if you have too many athletes who are devoting their entire lives to training, who have sponsorships, who have fans, people, myself included, talk down on this concept of, Instagram followers and just like dumb internet behavior from people. But there's thousands and thousands of people who are traveling to the CrossFit Games, who are watching the CrossFit Games, who are following these athletes on Instagram, who are emotionally invested in their process and their success. And that this entire ecosystem is necessary in order to create the sport and in order to have like a legitimate fitness test in order to crown people the fittest on earth, right? Because if no one else is willing to play because they just get cut right away and they feel like the events are out of their control and it doesn't really matter how they train, like there's just too much chaos in terms of dictating the outcome, then people are going to be less likely to put in the energy and effort necessary to push the sport to a high level. And I think that is negative for the sport as a whole, even though it doesn't necessarily impact who is, crowned fittest in one specific year.
And going back to what you're saying about the events, the only thing that I think could have been changed to be more well-rounded prior to cuts, because I think mostly it was a pretty good spread before the cuts, but over the games as a whole, there wasn't much heavy work. So they had the cleans, which there was only the top 10, which I think they couldn't have done that structure with more people in terms of, having one person go out at a time. But they could have structured it differently and had more people do that. And then the snatches in event 1. That was the only significant weighted movements within the games. The kind of pre-top 10 cuts were more gymnastics heavy. So the first workout, obviously you had the snatches, we had legless rope climb. The second one was really about the handstand walk for a lot of people. The third one was the ruck event. The fourth one was the sled bar muscle up. The fifth one was Mary. And then you had the sprint. So there was really not much loading other than those initial snatches before you've cut down to the top 10.
But I think that there's like a general movement, like away from the heavier work. I mean, don't get me wrong. I do love to watch speed clean ladders, and I thought that the way that they did the tie break for the clean was awesome. Like it was, for instance, watching Saxon Panchak against Noah Olsen. It was okay. Like Saxon Panchak, technically better, taking less time between lifts, but he was squat cleaning them. Whereas Noah Olsen was like doing sort of this Josh Bridges-esque power clean where his elbows were basically touching his sternum. And he was like, but he won based on. I mean, he did win based off of the foot that he led with, but he was taking longer between reps. But like so, you can sort of see, the evolution of, like, for instance, CrossFit weightlifting, and then weightlifting in sort of its purest form. I do believe that was a great event and that was a good way of doing it. But like, if you do look at, for instance, main site over the past, or since 2000, at the beginning of 2019, there's been workouts which have been like row 750 meters, L-sit for as long a time it took you to do the row, 3 rounds. So it's like, there's a lot more gymnastics focus going on,
right? But
I mean,
you had some of the women that couldn't even do the first bar, and couldn't even do the tie-break bar on the clean ladder, and I think it was just, hey, you've highlighted a weakness of these athletes, but they've already cut down to the top 10 by then.
But I mean, like Hayley Adams is what, 19?
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah, I think she was the athlete who struggled with but then, I mean, yeah, there is an element of that, and I think that this is something obviously that always just gets refined. But the weightlifting thing was cool to a certain extent. I think it was a little bit long-winded at some stages. Would have been cooler to sort of get them going a little bit more. But what I did do is it sort of just, the 2 weightlifters won.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And again, it comes down to the same thing. You're not changing the outcome of the winners. But my opinion on that would be that they didn't test well enough before that final cut, to the point where they had athletes who were unable to do movements unable to do the weight required in later workouts, which when you're in the top 10 of the game shouldn't happen.
Do you think, do you think sort of, we're saying Greg and Dave, but we don't necessarily know who's involved in this process as a whole, but do you think that they care much about the sort of the middle, or the people, for instance, who are basically the people who are not on the podium, and sort of like how that plays out? Just because I think that they have said that the goal is to get the fittest people on the podium and to crown the fittest people on earth. But then, like, for everyone else's experience, for everyone else's testing, obviously things can play out very, very differently. Like you said, Todd, this sport there's a high level of luck and chance that's already ingrained within the test. But do you think they care much about it?
I think that's one of the potential problems, right? Is that if you do say that we really only want to crown the fittest, I think that, like I was saying before, is an issue for the larger ecosystem of the sport, that the other people don't have a good experience, and aren't able to justify to themselves dedicating the necessary effort to training if they're going to, qualify to compete at the highest level, and then just have a bad experience, right? Because there's a lot of those people. You don't always see them or hear from them, but there's a lot of folks who make it to the CrossFit Games and then are like, wow, I just spent my entire life trying to do this, spent $10,000 that I didn't have to take off work and, live in Madison for 2 weeks and whatever. And I just left underwhelmed and didn't feel very good about it. So I think I'm just going to hang up my Metcons and, go back to doing something different. So I think that happens a lot, and that's going to happen in any sport. You're going to have people who churn out, but I don't think you want that to happen just because you didn't consider the implications of rule changes or the structure of the sport on all those individuals. You want everyone involved to have a good enough experience that you are actually having a broad spectrum of people who are competing and are able to compete, that are pushing the sport further along. And so, I don't think it's necessarily oh yeah, you need to, you get the gear and all that stuff that people are stoked on. But I think it's much more about making sure that the competition feels fair and professional to everyone involved. And I think that some of the negative reactions that people are having are related to those things, even though they're not necessarily articulating it in that way. So, what should be done instead? I mean, who knows? I think that the initial announcement that they made about making sure that everyone competes at the first 3 events in 2020 is a good start, right? Because that's going to at least make sure that people don't fly across the country to run 400 meters. It's like, okay, you at least get to participate. And then I do think that, as we talked about, the cuts were probably a little bit too early, just based upon the dynamics of the competition. And I just as a fan of the sport, I do actually like watching multiple heats, just to see different strategies and more opportunities to watch different athletes compete. And I also like the fact that spoilers can come from the earlier heats, but that may be something that is particular to me as someone who's like more of a nerd about the sport, who does want to, count how long people take between different sets and pay attention to their fractioning strategy and those types of things.
Todd was sat next to me in the bleach in the stand, and he had like a notepad out, and he had his stopwatch, and he was like, "So who you got for first and last?" And I was like, "Well, Tia's going to come first, and Matt's going to come first. I don't know who's going to come last." And then Todd would basically just call it. So I was like, all right, okay.
Yeah, I mean, that's you got to make predictions to calibrate yourself properly, right? You got to say who's going to come first. You got to say who's going to come last. You can even pick. It's top 3. Who are the top 3 and who's going to come last? That's the game you got to play.
I seem to remember a couple of years ago you were terrible at that, though. So, I mean, it's glad to hear you're improving, and you're improving your analysis. Because you really weren't. You were always good at the top person, but then you always missed the dark horses for each event.
Dark horse is in like an unexpected top performer.
Yeah, you're like, picking the winner you seem pretty good at, but then when you take the person who's not an obvious person to win an event, you seem to miss out on them.
Well, that's because they're not obvious, John.
Yeah, but you got to think. You got to think about it more.
You did not expect the unexpected,
and that is why you're never going to be a world class. I don't want to say coach, because you can be a world class coach, but I think betting strategist is probably the
or
phrase.
A pundit. I mean, I think they should. I think next year I might sort of at the back of the like Fit Aid beer garden, I might just sort of like set up an illegal like gambling sort of situation going on. But yeah,
I mean, someone has to come up with some sort of CrossFit fantasy sports scenario, right?
I've seen people try. I think just the amount of variables makes it harder.
Well,
what do you guys think of, to sort of segue out of that, what do you think is going to sort of come up with, because they're saying that there's still yet to be announced more sanctional events, and do you think that, I mean, this year was it was quite complex and sort of like how some people were qualifying for the games, but how do you think it will play out this year? This sort of, because now the season is about to start again in like 7 weeks.
Yeah.
Well, the one thing that hasn't been clarified, which I've heard kind of rumblings about, is are they taking the top 20 from the Open to the games?
Do you think that they need to? Because there were so many people that were like qualifying as national. I mean, there were. I suppose for all the people stateside, it makes sense.
I mean, I think. I don't know. I don't think the Open is a good enough test just to take someone to the games. But at the same point, I don't think we really saw anyone. I mean, we saw some people that qualified from the Open and didn't make it through the first event. But I don't think they were bad athletes that qualified from the Open. I think they just had a bad event.
Do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I just don't like people going straight from the Open to the CrossFit Games. I think that doesn't make any sense. I understand why it's set up that way.
Do you think like an age?
I think there's too many opportunities for untoward behavior. I think the Open isn't anything like an actual test at a sanctional or a live competition. There's too much opportunity for people to redo workouts repeatedly and use their favorite equipment and have a favorable judge and all that stuff. And I just don't like people going straight from the Open to the CrossFit Games. But if I get it.
Do you think that something like the age group qualifiers would be more appropriate for, say, for instance, for the national champions? potentially.
Yeah, but I mean, very
know.
clearly they want people from every country to go to the CrossFit Games, which I think is an admirable goal, and I understand why that's set up. So I don't have a better solution.
I mean, my opinion there would be you take national champions if they finish over a certain position in the Open.
No, but that defeats the purpose. You're trying to grow CrossFit internationally by having those people come. I actually do like the idea of having, everyone come to the CrossFit Games, go through 2 days of competition, then make cuts after. Like that to me, like, seems pretty reasonable, because it's like everyone comes, you get to have representatives from every country. Those people become, ambassadors for the sport in their local area. And then you can cut down the field to what we consider to be a more typical CrossFit Games field in the past, and then go from there. So that makes sense to me. And that seems like a pretty reasonable structure. I don't think we need the top 20 if there's going to be that many sanctionals.
The issue then becomes, you look at this year's, let's say that there's 26 sanctioned events. Is that right?
I think
I don't know.
They've announced. I think initially they announced like 18 or something, but they still have some to announce. So
I think there's over 20 right now.
But I think a lot of those are going to be pre-existing competitions.
Right.
I mean, majority.
But then you look at that and you say, out of, let's say, the top 30 at the games this year, if you lose 10 of those people, because there's only so many people that can qualify, are you sure that we're getting the top athletes at the games?
I think that the process last year was just too confusing and messy with all the like backfilling spots and everything like that. It was just super chaotic.
And I think part of it was they were sort of making it up as they were going along.
Yeah.
Well, you expect that.
Yeah.
Yeah, you expect that to happen.
Yeah.
I mean, personally, I love the backfill like process and trying to figure it all out, and I just enjoy that side of things. Not to say it's a good process, but personally, I liked looking at different permutations of, well, if this person finishes above this person, who gets the game spot?
Yeah, that it did make that interesting, especially like, for instance, at the Rogue Invitational. It was sort of, you weren't necessarily looking at the top heat, because at that stage everyone had made it to the games, but you were looking at that second heat and you're like, okay, cool, like who's here, who's going to make it? And I think that like in those later regions you'll start to see that. Those later sanctional events, you'll start to see that a lot more, and it'll make those things a little bit more interesting. But
I think we'll see it less if they don't take the top 20 from the Open.
Yeah,
because there'll be so, like, even at the Rogue Invitational, that being, I think that's kind of one of the middle ones in terms of schedule. There'll be maybe 3 or 4 people that have qualified as opposed to 15.
And what will be interesting as well is if, say, for instance, a lot of these bigger sanctional events because as much as not very many CrossFit athletes sort of they love to compete, right? So if they qualify via the Open to several different big sanctional events, it's likely they're just going to go for it, because that's going to be creating creating revenue for them. That's going to be creating opportunities to sort of like put themselves out there, and also just to compete more, which I thought, okay, people are going to be a little bit more selective in what they're going to do. They're probably going to look at this a little bit more seasonal, but people seem to be just like still competing as much as they can, and burying themselves, but they seem to recover from it as well. There's no way out. Interesting times.
Thanks for listening. While you're here, go ahead and head over to your podcast player, subscribe to the show, give it a rating, give it a review, all that good stuff. You can also go ahead and click through to the show notes, where you can find out more about us at legionsc.com, and also follow us on Instagram at legion.sc.